to a new episode of PDD listeners. I'm your host, Clara Peterson, and today we're speaking with Devon Bandison. Devon is one of the most sought-after personal and business coaches in the world. He works with Fortune 100 companies and people from all walks of life, including professional athletes, CEOs, salespeople, small business owners, filmmakers, producers, parents, and more. Devon was born and raised in New York City, where his love of sports and hard work resulted in him receiving a basketball scholarship to Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. After graduating, he spent years working on the front lines in NYC with an organization responsible for developing behavioral health programs for youth, families, and first-time fathers in some of the toughest neighborhoods throughout the city. As director of this organization, he was responsible for the clinical and leadership development of social workers, psychiatrists, and managers. He now serves as the director of children's services for the Community Mental Health Services Division, in addition to running his coaching company and keeping up with numerous coaching and speaking engagements. Devon holds a BA in psychology and a master's degree in public administration. And you'll notice that Devon is, I think, the first guest on the PDD podcast who is not directly involved in dance. We invited Devon to join us today because he has long been a leader in opening up and moderating anti-racism conversations with diverse groups of people. We've sought out a conversation with him now because, first of all, we feel that in our role as discussion leaders, seeking guests from diverse backgrounds, it's important that we educate ourselves and our listeners just on how best to approach conversations about race or even conversations that involve people of different races. And secondly, starting this month, PDD will be making an effort to schedule interviews focused specifically on racial justice in the dance world. We're kicking off this racial justice work with a series called LLAB with Antuan Byers, hosted by the wonderful Antuan Byers, who also joins us today. So welcome, Antuan, and welcome, Devon. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you. What a long intro, and just really quick for your community. Not only am I not in dance, I embarrassingly have done the same two-step for about 25 years wherever I do dance. But I've perfected the two-step. It's pretty good. But I'm open to learning from you guys. So.
But do you enjoy it? Do you like your two-step? Do you feel like you get down?
I love it. I mean, you know, you do the same thing for all those years. You got to get good at it. So at least I'm pretty good at the two-step.
I think we could turn that into a conceptual piece where you just do it over and over endurance all night.
I love it. Bring it on.
Pay to see it. Sold out. Let's go.
Which is true, actually. Yeah. A lot of conceptual work going on. And the point of dance is that you love it, as we have emphasized on this podcast numerous times. So love your two-step.
Yeah, I love it. And I love what you all are up to in your community. I think that, you know, I just want to acknowledge all of you and not only for what you do on a regular basis, but the fact that you're bringing this conversation into your community just says a lot of who you are in the world and what you're up to. So I'm just inspired by all of you, and I'm happy to be on the call.
Thank you, Devon.
Thank you, Devon.
The feeling is mutual. We're so inspired by the work you do.
Well, to kick off, let's dive right in. And Devon, can you tell us about your recent co-creating the bridge sessions that you hosted on Zoom, to give everyone a little background of where we're coming from, maybe help us understand your initial goal for those sessions and how you feel about the progress that was made by participants?
Yeah, it was a great thing that came, and I gotta back up a little and probably give you the backstory of how it came about. And you know, this year there's been a lot of conversation about, you know, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, all the way down to the most recent incidents. And this isn't a new conversation, right? This isn't a new conversation about institutional racism and inherent bias. And, you know, when these things started bubbling to the surface, it really, you know, it was one of those things that I put together that just felt natural. It was like I woke up, it wasn't something that I felt was any work. It was because I've been in this conversation all my life. And so the reason why I've been in this conversation all my life is, as considered a Black man in this country, I grew up, interesting enough, from a Black father and a white mother, and I often joke that I came out looking Latino, right? And early on, it was always a conversation of colorism and Black enough here, white enough here, and so this isn't new for me. And I remember my mom, at in my teenage years, and she always tried to kind of say, hey, I tried not to see race. And I remember having the conversation with my mom early on and saying, Mom, but you don't know how it feels when you walk down the street and someone's clutching their purse, or when you go into a store and people are following you. And at that moment, my mom realized that she had the best intentions not to see race, but by not seeing race, it was actually perpetuating something that wasn't helping the conversation. And from that point on, my mom became like, an investigator, right? Like always just asking questions and inquiry. And that's how I got into kind of my coaching practice, because I realized the power of asking really great questions. So when this happened this year, I woke up and I was like, this is a conversation that's just natural. I'm someone who kind of relates in very different worlds. I'm just as comfortable, growing up in Jamaica, Queens, as in a C-suite executive's office. Black, white, all different colors, all different socio and economic backgrounds. So it felt natural, and I created this weekly conversation. It was a 4-week, and then we had a recap of a 5th week conversation called Co-Creating the Bridge. And the goal was to bring people together from all walks of life to really have an open discussion of what it meant to be, what it means, racism means to them, and institutional racism and inherent bias. And, we ended up, I didn't know, I didn't market it. I just told people this is what's happening. And we ended up getting like 600 people to attend these sessions. And it really took off. And it was really powerful. We talked about people's experiences. And one of the things, Clara, I think is important is that nobody, not one person, has all the answers. I think that the important thing about this discussion is that we're in an open inquiry. That if we start asking better questions, if we start creating a safe space where people can disagree, where people can have different voting, right? Like people vote for one person, that they're not excluded from the conversation. People have grown up and have some, questions, they're not excluded. And what I found was this discussion has never really been moved forward in the most powerful way, because people are fearful. They're fearful they'll be judged. They're fearful that they can't ask the question that they really want to, because they'll be looked at as racist. So I used to start every one of these conversations with, what is the question or what is the comment that you want to make, but up until this point, you've been scared to make? And that's opened the door for this amazing discussion from people from all over. And I think you guys were part of it a couple of weeks. And it really has led to a lot of shifts and changes, because the other thing that kind of limits people is they think they need to change the world and they have to do this grand thing. And what I told them was, what is your stone in the bridge? Just one little stone. Not you don't have to change the world, but what's the one little stone? Meaning, a stone is different and it could change over time. So somebody's stone could be protesting. Someone's stone could be trying to change policy. Someone's stone could just simply be a conversation with their children that they've never had. And as a result of the 4 or 5 weeks, we've had some amazing outcomes of like what the people are up to in the world and how they're changing it. So I'm very proud of the work we've been doing.
That's amazing. And as someone who was a witness participant, and for our listeners and viewers, I'm Jessica Williams. But as a witness to a couple of weeks of this call that you held, I really appreciate that what you're doing is world building. And that really ties together with your concept of what is your stone in building the bridge. And I thought that was such an amazing way to frame everything, because while everyone in the call was having very difficult conversations, there is always this feeling of like, oh, this is so big. This is bigger than me. And I've had missteps in the past and I'm reckoning with that. But then on top of that, how do you then move forward? And I really appreciate your approach to honoring dissensus and not focusing on consensus building. And that is so important in world building. But I really appreciate your approach and thought it was effective, enlightening, and it just added to everyone's ability to add so much to the conversation.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And thank you for contributing too, Jessica, to the conversation. You know, that's the thing that keeps people stuck sometimes, is the fact that it feels so big that they don't know where to start. And the concept of the little stone was like, think about it. If we just committed 1%, like 1% to make a change every day, in about 3.5 months, it would be 100 days, you'd be 100% further along than you are today. And that's a different way of approaching something than we're normally like, I'm fired up, I'm going to change it all tomorrow. And then when you hit, a roadblock, we're back to square one. So we were really looking at how do we just move it a little each day. And as we look back, it's amazing what was created. And the other thing that I love that you said, Jessica, I agree, is like, the census is like, how do we disagree without being disagreeable? How do we bring people around who have different points of view, who we may not even like their point of view, but can we create a space where that's okay? That like we can disagree and not be disagreeable.
Because we don't live in a space like that right now. We don't have that space. We don't practice that muscle of disagreeing but not being disagreeable. So I love that you make that distinction.
Yeah, absolutely, Antoine.
Yeah, and where that also shows up is cancel culture. And now there's all these viral videos going around where Karen's doing something bad again. And I think it's important to witness and actually show what's happening in the world.
For sure.
It's very interesting how dissensus is often shut down in a lot of conversations.
Yeah, and that historically has been where we've stopped. So what happens is we move some stuff forward, but then once it becomes too uncomfortable, people take their ball and go home. Yeah. Right? Like there's some unconscious thought that this shouldn't be uncomfortable. And if we start building the muscle of like, can we start getting comfortable being uncomfortable, then I think that is where stuff starts to change in this world.
I love that. Comfortable being uncomfortable. Yeah. It's like comfortable being awkward.
Yeah, exactly. And because if we don't allow for that, then every time this is a big conversation. It's about, years and institutions that have been built a certain way so that the game that is played is rigged, right? And only until we identify that the game is rigged, and we have the people who help rig the game, help like create a new one with us, it's the only way it's going to change. It's not going to change by just a certain group of people saying this isn't right. We need actually the people who know that the game is rigged and were part of rigging the game to be part of the change. And that's why consensus building and bringing people into the conversation is important.
Yeah.
What do you say? Yeah.
That's interesting, because I honestly feel like a lot of people in our generation, liberal, progressive people for the most part, kind of feel like we need to wait for some of the old guard to die out and then just like get new people in there with more progressive thoughts. How do you get there? How do you build consensus or get that kind of change for someone who's like deeply complicit in the system? Like some of these senators, these assholes who are just like voting down everything useful. Are they just like not the target? I mean, how? Yeah.
And I think where I connect with your question, Clara, and what I witnessed in the Co-Creating the Bridge series that Devon coordinated is there were some questions like, how do you have these conversations with your family members or with other people within the political divide? And I thought Devon's approach and response was really interesting in that it focused on, when you start a conversation with wanting to change someone's mind, that comes from an interesting place. And I took that to heart, because I think I often enter political conversations or conversations about race with, well, let me tell you something. So I'm curious, like, what you think of all of that, Devon?
Yeah, I think you said it wonderfully, and because you were, part of the conversation. I used to joke, like, if there's two people the exact same, there's no use for one of them. Like, right? Like, if you got two of the exact same people, what's the sense of the other, right? So the fact that there's differing opinions, is actually a great place. That's what makes our country and our world so diverse. So, like Jessica said, most people go into conversations, and first of all, they don't even listen. They're listening to what they want to say. So while someone's talking, they're in their head trying to see what they want to get across. Secondly, they're listening, trying to hear from a place of right, wrong. So literally, we're listening to someone, we're saying, that's right, that's wrong, that's good, that's bad. And what we tried to recreate and co-create in the bridge is a different way of listening. Can we listen from a place of like neutrality, of like, I may not agree, it may not be what I believe, but can I allow for them to believe what they believe? And that's okay. We had a guy who, we talked about experiences of people. We had a principal in there, a Black principal, who talked about his experience of getting pulled over by police and brutality. And we had a guy in there who was a white man, older white man, who said, he raised his hand, he was uncomfortable, and he said, listening, I have been unconsciously unaware of the pain that I hear on this call. And I can see where my bias, like, I've been racist. I'm a racist. And the guy was on the call, broke down crying, and said, and I'm no longer okay with that. And see, that breakthrough would never have happened if he was judged for being on the call, if he didn't feel comfortable. And that conversation moved so much, so many people on that call, that like it opened up other people to say, hey, I got family members who are racist. I have, and how do I have these conversations? And the way to have it, I believe, is to really come from a place of inquiry, like really questioning, really asking, and not trying to prove your point, because we think we know way more than we actually do. We think we got this thing called knowledge of the world down, and there's so much more to learn. And if we're open for it, I think that great things can happen. And Clara, to your point, we have to allow for this space of differing opinions and things we actually don't like. I go to the gym. I don't like lifting weights all the time. Like, I don't like really, like, I would rather just chill on like a massage chair. But I understand that, like, when I get comfortable being uncomfortable, that there's a breakthrough that happens, that there's a transformation that happens if I stay in the game. And that's what we're really trying to create here.
I like that. It's like almost like you're abandoning the idea of like, well, these are the problem people who I have to change their mind, and you're just trying to open up the space around you as much as you can.
Yeah.
Just listen and
what are you gonna do?
as you go.
Like trying to like eliminate everyone who you don't like or who says something you don't like. It's like,
these days,
I mean,
like good.
I'd go to life on that. Just kidding.
I think on the Trump side, like, sure, yeah, but that makes sense. We can't. Yeah.
But the problem with that, from my perspective, is if we don't there's people on that side who have legit reasons why they believe what they believe. They're not all the same, right? Like, I know people who vote for Trump who, I would say are good people who want change in the world, but like, they just see the world different. And if we don't include people in the conversation that we don't agree, we'll only get half of the thing solved. And we need what we're talking about here is what it means to be human, like transforming what it means to be a human being on this planet. And that's a big undertaking. And for you to take that on, you need everybody. And some people won't be involved, just they don't want to, but you have to create the space where there's diversity in that.
And I think also, to your point, what really resonates for me, when you're really listening to someone, you're also choosing your language differently, because you're meeting someone where they are. And that is a very important step to change, whether that be clinical change or change on ideas. And I think where this came up for me, I mean, it comes up almost every day, but like when defund the police first became mainstream, my first initial thought was like, oh my God, yes, it's gone mainstream. But then my second thought was, no, change the words, because I was just thinking about my conservative family from Ohio and how they responded. And they actually already reached out to me to have conversations about it. And I approached them with language that I knew they would appreciate. And in the end, it was a good conversation. But I think when you're really listening, you're not just using the same language you would use with everyone. And I think it's also important.
So good, Jessica. I mean, I have a saying that your words create your world. Like literally, words create your world, right? Think about it. Like Antoine's down there. If there was 4 men next to Antoine and I didn't know his name, I wouldn't know he's an Antoine. The reason why he's an Antoine is someone gave a word and enough people agreed. And if Antoine tomorrow said, I'm changing my name to Muhammad Ali, he created a new world, and that would be his name, right? So think about it. Words create worlds. Segregation, desegregation. Married, divorce. And so messaging is important. Defund the police, while people who are behind the scenes may know what it means, when you're talking about a whole conservative or other parts of the country, that languaging and that message is very scary to hear for people, because they think about defunding the police as you're taking police away, and when I'm in trouble, I won't be able to get a police officer to save me. And I think that's where people, they get ahead of themselves and aren't as thoughtful of how things will be received, because what they're really talking about is this thing that you and I know, Jessica, very well, is called social determinants of health. There's these areas in life that you can almost predict that people are going to have opportunities to have a successful life or struggle. And it's these areas of education, housing, safety in your community, job opportunities. These things, these social determinants of health, is what initially what people were talking about when they said it wasn't really defunding the police. It was reallocating funds to go into these 4 or 5 areas of social determinants of health. But instead of saying that, people just heard defunding the police, which made everyone go to their corners and say, see, we can't even meet in the middle. So we got to find a way to bring people together through language. Our language is how we can bring people together. It creates a world.
Yeah, it is world building.
Interesting. Well, I do want to ask, in light of our overall purpose here and the fact that we're a podcast or a conversation-based medium, I am curious, do you have any advice, Devon, for, I guess, to start with, maybe just general parameters or guidelines that anyone of any race should be aware of when they're approaching a direct conversation about race and about racial justice and anti-racism? And kind of connected to that, are there times when a direct conversation or a direct question is not the right approach? How do we find that balance?
Well, first of all, tune in to you guys and tune into the lab with my guy Antoine over there. Conversation.
Yes.
I think
come through.
That's right. Come through. I think, because I think conversations like this is important. It gives people language to be able to articulate what they're feeling, right? And a lot of times, because it's been behind the scenes so much in people's minds, people are worried about how it's going to come across and how they're going to be received, right? So a couple of parameters for me is like, this conversation is always permission based, right? Like, it may not be the time. So I want to ask people, are you open to having a conversation around this? And when I ask that, I let them know, like, yes or no are perfectly fine. Like, most people ask questions, hey, you want to talk about this? And they're like, no. And then they still talk about it anyway. So you got to really be sincere about really asking permission. Yes, no, or make a counter offer. Like, maybe we can discuss this another time. Would that be more appropriate? Yes. So 1, get off of your agenda and make the people in front of you the agenda. Like, really create a space where it's permission based. 2, for me, go into the conversation in like Inspector Clouseau, maybe, not Inspector Gadget. That, I like, that was my guy, but like really in inquiry, like in inquiry, like asking a question, not to align it with what you think is true, but really asking a question to try to hear something and something different. Be open to something different. And then also, I think, Clara, what's important is listening from a place of neutrality, not listening from right or wrong, good or bad, because that's all a lens. Right, wrong, good, bad is all a lens. And what it does is it limits our ability to expand, our own appreciation, our own knowledge. And if you don't allow things that you don't agree with or make you uncomfortable you're just going to stay in your own box. And I do think that that's important, like Jessica was talking about, to really have the patience to be able to speak to people like, people in your family who may be older, who maybe have more ingrained in them. And for you to go at them and trying to change them into, what you believe is probably not the best approach. It's really to try to have an inquiry back and forth so you can learn from them, they can learn from you, so they don't feel like they're being spoken at, but they're being spoken with. And think about it, right? You ever have a teacher in school who came in front of the class and they were telling you, like, they acted like they knew it all, right? Or they were telling you their way was the way. How did you connect with that person? Yeah. Right? We hardly did. But someone who opened the discussion, said, hey, I'd like to learn from you and hear from you, you were probably more likely to connect with and be able to learn from. So.
And there is some research in deep canvassing efforts that show, if you're doing some kind of like political canvassing as one example, and you actually listen to the person who you're canvassing and you let them speak like a large majority of the time, and when they feel heard, then they will actually ask you your views. Not all the time, but they're more willing to listen to what you are going to say, which I find interesting. But I do also find it difficult. I have my moments, as compassionate as I try to be, because you have to build that compassion for yourself when you're building a bias awareness practice. I have moments where I'm just like, oh my God, I cannot believe they still think that. Or, there's triggers there. And I find I have to be in a place of self-care, and I have to be in a good place before I can have these conversations with certain people. And that doesn't mean I'm avoiding the conversation, but I think there's going to be a lot of discomfort. I mean, I think that is also very much part of the process, and leaning into that discomfort.
Yeah. Can I add to that?
Oh, please.
And so, Jessica, I think that your point is so well taken, because we may not listen to people, like you say, man, Devon said, I'm going to try to not listen from right or wrong, good or bad, but we do it with ourselves. So sometimes you have a judgment of people, and then the judgment becomes of yourself, of like, am I wrong for doing that? Am I right for doing that? And you got to allow for yourself to have that human experience too, right? Like we're never, ever going to get this thing down. That's what I tell people. What it is the practice. Right. I used to like a group from ATL, the ATLians, you remember that album?
Yeah. Outcast,
right?
Yeah.
And there was a song where they said, never, ever, ever, ever. And when I talk about this conversation, it's like, you're never, ever, 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 ever going to get it. But what we're going to do is we're building a practice. We're practicing our way through. Practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes progress. And we have to allow ourselves to fall short, to be in judgment sometimes, to have that human experience, because it will just allow us to connect with other people when they fall short, when they have their own judgments, when they come across a certain way. And that's what we have to connect with people, not showing people how much we know and how perfect we are, but showing how inspiring we are by how we deal with our imperfections, because we all have imperfections.
That's so real. And, in a lot of the work I'm doing right now, I'm establishing a new organization for Black dancers to come together. And I'm thinking about a lot of the stuff you said. And this reminds me of some work that I've been reading by Tima Okun. in talking about white supremacy culture and how it shows up in our spaces. And I love the example you gave about the classroom and like a different teacher and how we respond to those different types of teaching. And I think it's really important for us to understand that those are ways that white supremacy culture shows up in our spaces, like the idea of perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word. These are all ways that that shows up in our spaces. And some other things that I would offer as I develop kind of some community guidelines for cultivating as much of a safe space as possible, because I love what you said. It's not possible to ever create 100% of a safe space. But I think it's important for us to all work towards that. But also recognizing that intent doesn't always equal impact, and recognizing or entering conversations, trying to assume that the other person means good and means well. But also recognizing that every time we mean something, it doesn't always come across that way. And then also understanding, I love what you said about both and versus either or thinking, and how limiting that can be. And I also think it's really important, I try to share with people to speak from their own experience, to make sure that they're not telling back someone their own oppression to their face. So I love all the things you share, but just sharing some of the things that I'm trying to take into my practice that kind of fit into that world as well. So thank you for dropping all those gems.
You got it, Antoine. Thank you. Thank you for the work. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just thought that was so interesting. You said worship of the written word. I hadn't realized that was kind of an ingrained part of like white supremacy, but it makes sense because, you know, oppression has often been tied up with illiteracy, you know, holding people back from education.
Yeah.
And that's why spoken word, that's why we actually can create a new world based on our word of what we're creating. And that's what I mean by our words create our world, not the written world, because history is actually how Black community has always looked at it, or a lot of the Black community was his story. That's how we looked at history. That's his story in that written word, you know? So like we're creating a new way to kind of look at the world and how we relate by our words, not the written word.
Yeah, and everyone doesn't learn or prosper in every situation. So, you know, I know even in the work that I'm doing with Dance Artists National Collective, we're reimagining the way that we give out information. Does a super long email, is that the best way that everyone can receive information? Is an agenda meeting every Monday from 1 to 2:30, is that really the most accessible meeting format for everyone? Does everyone learn the best in that situation? Does everyone receive information the best in that way? So I think that's all important. And even like thinking about how once we say something, we're not allowed to like change our mind, or, you know, I think that comes up a lot as well. So I think that's a part of it too. And I love this emphasis you put on storytelling, Devon, because I think that in a lot of cultures, that is the way that information is passed down. And I also think that, you know, what's great about this, and as well as the upcoming series, is that we're continuing to have those conversations, continuing to tell those stories that often aren't told because they don't have the platform, or because their way of storytelling doesn't fit into our system's preferred way of receiving information.
Yeah, and I mean, you said it very well. And one thing I like to point out, and you know, what's a good podcast without some controversy? But like, you know, there's a difference between information and transformation, right? And what often occurs, and people come from a good place, and my white sisters and brothers, there's a thing called white guilt, right? Where there's so much guilt that's built in that they come from this place. And it reminds me of, in the movie Malcolm X, there was a white woman and people were so offended by this point. And she was like, I'm a believer in the cause, and you know, I want to help, and how can I help? And Malcolm X looked at her and says, you can't. And it wasn't that white people can't. He knew she was coming from this place of white guilt. And what we need to do is have white people, our sisters and brothers, come in, and you don't need to be guilty for things that happened years ago or last week. We need you to be kind of co-creators in this thing, like to be partners in this thing, rather than like you have to make up for years of oppression, because that really is going to keep us in a cycle, right? So we want you to be and to be open that your Black friends aren't responsible for educating you. right? Like I have some people, we call it co-create. What's your rock? And I got some people who said, Devon, I'm tired of carrying the rocks, man. Like I've been carrying these rocks all my lives. So what we need you guys to do is also get on the court. Like what I say is a basketball term, or like on the court rather than in the stands. And you can read a lot, and you could read White Fragility. You could do all this stuff, which is great. But what's better than that, is taking that information and turning into real little action, transformation, as small as a conversation you'd never have before, or a podcast interview that you've never, like you guys are doing, or, you know, creating more space in the community to move some policy forward. Whatever it is, we want to move it from like information to transformation, to real live change that we see in our lives.
That's great. And I think a lot of questions that are coming up recently with what you speak about information to transformation is now a lot of institutions, nonprofit organizations, corporations, all kinds of institutions, arts organizations, they know now is the time to look at policies and ask that question, where does racism exist here? And I think now everyone's sort of in this collective struggle, like, how do we do that? And I know a lot of consultants are being used in this space. So yeah, I don't even know what my question is here, but.
Well, you didn't get me on here to like just agree with everything in the status quo. So there's a thing going on. I've been invited by organizations to do this thing called D&I, diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I've turned it down every time because this is the conversation I'm having with people. That these one-time, one-off trainings will not help. They won't, because this is an ongoing conversation. So if you want to bring me in, for instance, to the organization, what I tell them is, I will do a 1 or 2 day thing, but this has to be built in to a system continually, that there's conversations happening continually, monthly, quarterly, there's coaching along the way, something. So this isn't just the flavor of the month. And that's the danger here. The danger is that people are all, you know, they get all in an uproar, and we're protesting, and they see on TV the injustices, and then once that dies down, they're no longer really on the court. It's gone. So what we need this to be more of a sustainable 1% a day. How do we move it forward each day? Ask yourself the question. How am I contributing to the change today? What is my 1% that I'm going to move this conversation forward in my own life? And if we just took the individual responsibility of moving it forward 1% each day, it will be sustainable. We'll get momentum. We'll be ready for conversations. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I agree, because a lot of this is so engraved in everything we do. So you can't fix 400 plus years of bullshit with like 1 or 2 days of a workshop. This anti-Blackness and racism is engraved and sewn into a lot of the systems that we all participate in. So we have to continuously work at it. And I love that you say that. And I also saw in one of your interviews, you said, does your audio match your video? And I love that, especially thinking of a lot of our organizations and dance companies right now. We're seeing all the audio, we're seeing all the Instagram and the Facebooks and tweets and everything. But what about the video, right? What are you gonna do after that? And this is continuous work. So I love that you made that distinction, for sure.
Does your words match your actions? Does your audio match your video? If I had a camera that was secretly following you through the day, what would that show me? Would it show me all that stuff that you're putting on Instagram, or would it show me a different picture? Not that we're looking at you to be perfect, but like, can your audio match your video? Can your words? I love that you did your research, my man.
Well, I love that. So I heard that. I was like, let me write that down. That was so good, you know? Yeah.
That's why we love Antuan.
Oh.
Hyper prepared.
And it's real. We're all watching it happen, you know? I started this new organization I'm starting off of what I call the Blackout Tuesday on Instagram, when I felt like the world was telling us to be quiet, but the last thing I wanted to do was be quiet. I had so much to say. So watching all of these people post and black out their screens, I'm like, okay, that's the audio to me. Yep. But where's the video? You know, where's that next step? What are you doing on this day off? You know, and then every day after this. Yeah.
And it's such a good point, Antoine. And that's why giving people permission to just pick a stone in the bridge and understanding that there's no stone too little, and over time your stone can change. So sometimes people's stone in this is, it's such a new conversation that they're like, I don't know yet. I just need to learn more. And that's okay. And then some people are like, all right, I learned and now I want to be in different conversations. And then some people are like, I want to change policy. Some people, you know, so we have people in co-creating the bridge who are now influencing politicians and policy around race. We had other people who are creating children's series of leadership and books around race. We have people who are having conversations with their conservative, historically racist parents and family members around race, who are teaching their children different. I mean, these are all, we have people protesting. I mean, these are all super important. We have people who recreated their whole business model. They had a company and they restructured their whole business model to incorporate this as an ongoing conversation. So everything, no matter what you choose, is important. Don't think it's too little or too big. And I think that that's the permission that we want to, and like you said, Antoine, as long as you're moving something forward, like you're not just talking and it looks good, but like, can you move something forward each day?
One thing I did want to talk about at some point, to drill down a little further from what I asked before about approaching these conversations, is how specifically we as white women who have hosted the podcast for a long time can think about going into conversations, whether they're specifically about racial justice in dance or not, or just an interview with a Black dancer or a person of color or another minority. What should we be keeping in mind as we're approaching those conversations? That said, Antoine is hosting the meat of our upcoming series about racial justice in dance. So Antoine, if you want to interject and ask something first, feel free. But I just wanted to put out there at some point, I'd love to circle back for us to kind of take something with us as we go forward longer term.
Yeah, so real quick, our new series starting very soon is the LLAB, which stands for Listening, Learning, and Building. And that's a space where we create space to share Black stories in the dance world and dissect how white supremacy shows up in our dance spaces, as well as dream of ways in which we can move forward to a dance world that is safe for all of us to access, participate in, and thrive. So these are a lot of the things that we're talking about today, are a lot of the topics that we're going to be discussing in the future episodes of the podcast. So some issues we've talked about are like representation, which is a big one, and how we see a lot of dancers on billboards but not in the boardrooms, and we need representation throughout, so not just in our classrooms, which I know we hear a lot about, but as in our dance companies, choreographers, directors, but also our staff. We need makeup artists of color, hair artists of colors to work with those artists of color. We also hear about point shoes and tights and all of that. So that representation shows up there. If you have a pair of tights called skin or flesh and you only sell one color of those tights, what does that mean? What are you telling your dancers, your Black dancers, your dancers of color who are coming into your store trying to enter this field? Same thing with leadership positions and boardrooms. I love, Devon, that you talked about colorism, and I think that shows up a lot, as well as tokenism. And I love what you said. I experienced this a lot, not being Black enough for Black spaces, but also not being white enough for white spaces. I think that shows up a lot. And I think that this competition between minorities is something that is systemically designed to pin us against each other. And there's usually only one spot for a Black person or a person of color. And I often hear that Black people shouldn't be against each other. Black people shouldn't be in competition with each other. And that we all can eat. And I agree with that, but I think that it's important for us to recognize that within this system, that doesn't always happen. There's usually only one spot for a Black person or a person of color. So the system is created for us to take each other out, to make it easier for those at the top. And also the way that our culture is appropriated, the cultures of Black and brown people, how our stories, we just talked about this, our stories, our dances and music can be put on stage, but many of us are not allowed to tell our stories or dance our own dances on those same stages, at least not without the help of white people in power, which we've also talked about a little bit. So I think that all of these things are things that we're going to discuss later on in the podcast. But yeah, just a little sneak peek.
Amazing. What do you guys each think? Because I keep hearing two opposite things at different times about, like, obviously white people have to be involved, you know, we have to change, right? And so sometimes I feel like the message is we should do the majority of the work, and then sometimes I feel like the message is we should step back because we don't understand and haven't been through the experience, you know, to guide us in the right direction. Where should we land on this? I'm really curious to hear from both of you.
Yeah, I don't think now is not the time for anyone to step back. And it's like, so for me, it's you got to step up, right? And you can't expect, you know, Black people have been carrying these stones, like I said, for a long time. And there's some Black people who are just like, I'm tired. Like, you know, we see another march, we're tired of marching. We're tired of protesting. And so what we need is the people who were part of rigging the game to help create a new game. So I think that white people have to do their work and do their homework and be okay with, you know, when asking a Black friend. Like I have a friend who always asks me, she's like, is this cool for me to ask you now? And it's okay for you, like, not to be able to want to talk about this with me. And that's important. Because, you know, that's part of it, this expectation that we have to educate white people. And I think that if you guys, you know, if white people and our white brothers and sisters did the work and then brought it back and said, hey, is this a good time to, you know, ask you some questions and how can we contribute? I think that's a whole different way than like either just stepping back or just, you know, expecting us to lead and tell you which way to go. Because this is built in, like Antoine said, this is institutional. You know, this is in every asset of, you know, policing. It's in every aspect of the court system. It's in every aspect of the communities, you know, and when he talked about colorism, like it's always been white has been right. Yellow is mellow, you know, like as you got on and the darker the hue, the more, scary it was for the white community. And so, you know, and that was all articulated in the Willie Lynch papers. So there was things that have been historically built into our Constitution, to our laws, that, you know, slavery is still in there. You know, 3/5 of a human being is still in there. So like, you know, like, so we need
see it.
Yeah, we see it. So like, I think to your point and your question, Clara, the fact that you're asking how is a great start. The second is that we need our white brothers and sisters to do their homework and then come back and be okay with, if they ask their friends, like, hey, can you tell me about this? Be okay with them saying, I don't want to tell you about this right now. And not letting that be the door that shuts you down from continuing to move forward. Because there'll be other people who are ready to bring you on and say, hey, yeah, sit down, ask me whatever you want, or, you know, I'm down for this. But we have to allow all of that because people have different ways in which they're addressing this, and not all is the same way.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Devon said, 1,000%. I love what you said about the 3/5 though, because that's something we still experience today. I mean, look at our dance classrooms, look at Black people in leadership position. That's where it shows up. That's that 3/5. We don't have the same access to power. So I just wanted to throw that in there. And then just one thing to add, I think, like I said, Devon summed it up great, but I think we have to just all remember our privilege in these conversations. And I think that's the difference. And that's the factor, is that white people usually have more privilege to have certain conversations act in a certain way based on safety, do certain things within this movement that a lot of our Black brothers and sisters and people of color and trans brothers and sisters or folks with disability, these people don't always have the same access. So I think that's the important part to remember, is that we have to let Black people and people of color tell their stories, just like Devon said, and be there ready and willing to listen, but also just understand our privilege and what power we actually have, and then from there decide what our role should be in this situation. But I agree, no one should be stepping back. And I think that if anyone has heard that, I think that maybe, again, language and communication, maybe that wasn't communicated the same way. Maybe a person of color felt like their toes were stepped on, or that someone else was trying to tell their story. But I think as far as the work and the activism, we're all a part of it, you know, and it requires all of our hands to fix it. All of our hands were here messing it up. Some of us by choice and some of us not, but we're all a part of it. So we all have to be a part of it. And that goes with the learning too. In this conversation, I've learned a lot. And I've been doing anti-racism work as a Black person who thought I was the, you know, anti-racism work of this country, but there's still so much to learn for all of us. So I think the same thing that we kind of carry in all of the work we do, there's always so much more to learn and always so much more to do.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well said. And you know, I just to add to what Antoine's saying is, like, I hear a lot of how bad things are, right? And how the country is this and that. But like, we have an opportunity here like no other time. Like we are creating, I got chills that actually we're having this conversation on the call, and like Antoine said, of like moving this forward and having two white women and a Black man and another Black man and experiencing this. Like, we are the new history books. We are rewriting history. Like, and the question is, like, what are we going to tell our children and our grandchildren? Like, when this time came for us to step up and really make a difference, what were you doing? Were you on the sidelines, or were you really about like change? Did you just want to be heard and be seen on Instagram as someone doing it? Or were you really invested in the change? And for me, that's what this is about. And you can't, for me, I can't get there by putting people in boxes, judging people, and not allowing for anyone who wants to come, no matter who they vote for, no matter how they look at things, to come along, because we need everyone. This is not going to be a certain group that's going to change everything. It's going to be more conversations like this that get bigger and bigger and bigger and more inclusive. Mm-hmm. Because you can't deal with exclusion. You can't deal with racism by excluding people from the solution, because you're doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, you're doing the same thing, following the same model that is the systemic problem.
So we always look at an old model to try to recreate, and what we're talking about here is a brand new model.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing, sorry, real quick, that's the only thing we haven't done. I say this all the time. We've done Band-Aids, we've done addendums, we've done amendments, we've done everything to fix all of these issues. But then the one thing that we haven't done is burn this sucker down and start from the top. And we're also afraid of that, right? We're also afraid of uncovering all of that history, that nasty, dirty, disgusting history that we all have. But that's the one thing, Devon, I love that you said that. That's the one thing we haven't done, is starting this whole thing over. And it's going to take us a while, because a lot of us are afraid of that. We find comfort in this system that serves none of us, really, except for maybe a few of us at the top, like 20 people, literally, like 20, 25 people. Millions of people are finding comfort in this system that serves a handful of people. So we have to be willing, if we want to gain it all, we have to be willing to risk it all. And that goes for everyone.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. This is just more of a quick aside, but I think the tension between like how much do you do as a white person, how much do you let other people lead, is exactly what you said, Antoine, about telling someone's story, like who should be leading the telling of the story. And it kind of ties into what you said, that prompted my question of like, who's at the top of this process? And are they representing a story they should be representing, or are they kind of using other people in a way that doesn't make sense?
They're making money from other people's stories.
Right.
That's an
money comes
important,
in.
yeah.
And I just wanted to say, I mean, I think that's, I imagine a lot of that will be touched on and uncovered in the series that you're leading as it applies to the dance world, because I think there's a lot, I mean, there's a lot of that in the dance world because we're telling stories. Not because people are particularly mean and nasty, but we have the same systemic hierarchy in the dance world, and a lot of the people at the top telling the stories. I mean, maybe they, you know, I think a lot of what we have to think about in dance is who's the right person to do this specific job, in addition to so many other questions of how we diversify the classroom and but really leadership, and how things are flowing down. So I'm excited to like kind of uncover some of that as you go through your series about dance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hierarchy allows for comfortable and allows for it not to be messy.
Yes.
And people are most scared of messiness, but like it has to be messy. You have to break down the hierarchy in order to create a whole new game. And sometimes I think that, you know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. So you can have all these outbursts and, you know, all these things and all these new, but if you're following the same hierarchical system, the same kind of institutional system, then you're really just putting lipstick on a pig, so to speak. And we have to be willing to kind of scramble all that up and start from a whole new place. And I think that, you know, conversations like this is important, the questioning of it, you know, like really questioning what is the sense of this? Because top down approaches, we got to look at what are we judging by top? Is it more the most money, the most prestige? Like, what does top mean? And like,
That's
if we don't even question what that is, then we're still in the same system.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's good for us to define that too. Like you just said, what is the top and what is the bottom? And this is something that I've been exploring in a lot of my work. And I found that, you know, I've been having conversations and we'll think of any room. We'll think of a dance studio. We'll think of an office building. We'll think of a sports team. We'll think of any room you can think of and who's at the top and who's at the bottom. And then I would say 99.99999% of the time, white men are at the top and Black femmes and the disabled are at the bottom. And I mean, we probably don't have time today, but I encourage all of our listeners to think of any situation you can think of, and more than likely that will be the power dynamic in that situation. And we have to acknowledge that. And like Devon was just saying, working from the top down, we actually have to work from the bottom up and work with our minority and marginalized communities. So where does that start? And I think that's a great place to start the work, to kind of go back to our question from earlier too.
Yeah, and recreating the language that there is even a bottom. Like this is even bottom versus top.
Yeah.
100%.
You know, so.
Yeah, it's interesting how we do get stuck in our language, and that by virtue like communicates a value system.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. I'm not sure if this question is going to come out clearly because it's not super clear in my mind, but I feel like Devon, your background as an athlete, and obviously one who worked very hard and pursued it very intensely, is very similar to where we're all coming from in the dance world. I mean, it takes the same kind of dedication and hard work and training and learning from others. I'm not sure what it's like with the coaching relationship, but with the ballet master and ballet student relationship, it's very much almost in the old style school of tutelage where you're teaching someone physically how to do this craft, and there's a lot that you have to learn and absorb from that person and those people. I think I'm curious about your perspective on how do we break this down? Because we have to have the people who really understand the craft to teach it on the level, to get to the level that we all kind of reached in like the pursuit of this, either dance or sport or whatever. And at the same time, we want to open it up and even ask ourselves whether there has to be a top and a bottom. How can we maybe think about approaching that in an activity that it takes such in-depth learning? I think.
Yeah, and so like I always learned Like how I learned to become a great basketball player is I watched the great basketball players and mimicked their moves. And then finally I got my own voice. And the only difference between a master and a student is that the master, the true master, knows that he's always a student. So the best teachers are always the ones that, yes, I've accumulated this knowledge and I'm willing to share. But the greatest teachers I know, the true masters, are the ones that while they're teaching, they're still open to learning. It doesn't mean they dumb themselves down or their skill set and they don't teach how they're teaching in dance or in sports. But what they do is that old school paradigm of leadership of do as I say, not as I do is played out. And they come from a leadership in regards to influence. And how you can influence people is by sharing and teaching, but also by listening. So I think that when you talk about mastery in dancing or in sports, the great teachers, the great masters are the ones who are able to articulate and share that with people and let them see something different about themselves, but also in the process being open from learning from the same person who's in front of you. It's the same thing in leadership. I had people who I've worked with who had the title of leader, CEO, but wasn't leaders at all. And how I look at leaders is, do you treat the CEO the same as you treat the janitor? And for me, that's where there's no top or bottom. It's a human connection. And it's like, I'm always willing to teach, but I'm always willing to learn. And I think that's how I view that dynamic.
Yeah, I agree with that. And everyone has a role that matters, which is what I got from the last point you made. And this is something, well, I think it's important for us to understand, again, that a lot of this stems from white supremacy. The idea that there's one person at the front and everyone in the back has to listen. 100 years ago, that's the same thing that was happening. This idea in our dance studios that we have to shut up and dance and we're not allowed to ask questions and talk back. My ancestors were told to just shut up and dance. So this is a system that is continuing to show up. This old school paradigm is real old school, and it's called white supremacy. And I just want to tie that together. And I love what you said. In order to teach, you must learn. And in order to continuously teach, you must be continuously learning. And it's a process that's constantly happening. Yeah, so I love that there doesn't always have to be a leader, but there can be a guide, right? That we're all learning and working together to get to a common goal or place.
I like that word. I'm kind of trying to, as we speak, like put this into the context of like what I've experienced, which is a ballet class, extremely hierarchical, the way you describe Antoine. But it would have been interesting sometimes if I felt empowered when they gave me a correction to say, well, the reason I feel like that doesn't work for me is that this is how it feels when I try to do that in my body. And then you can have a conversation and actually get somewhere, because it took years sometimes to realize like certain corrections I was getting I just couldn't do, and why, and to find my own workarounds. So it actually could, even in our field that is very specific and technical, like it could having more of a conversation.
And that would make them a better teacher if you started that conversation with them. Like, oh, some people with this type of turnout can't do this thing. It's an iterative teaching process.
And knowing the why and being able to articulate that. Why do I have to be in 180-degree turnout? There should be a good reason why, right?
Good point.
Right? Like, I mean, if you're a great teacher, you'll be able to break all of this stuff down and like teach all of this stuff. So I 100% agree, but it also shows up in other things. Like, I was taught that my question has to be earth-shattering before I raise my hand and ask a question. I need to think about it 1, 2, and 3 times before I even ask a question. Or like if we have to use the restroom, you have to ask yourself 3 times, do I really have to use the restroom? Like the fact that someone has full ownership of us when we're in a room is an issue, and I think it sounds crazy because we're not used to working in these types of ways, right? But if we look at other cultures around the world, this isn't how everyone works. You have autonomy over your body. So this is another way that I think this shows up.
Yeah. I would have loved if they had different classes for people with different levels of turnout, and they didn't like try to make it seem like you couldn't go anywhere if you didn't have the turnout, but just like taught you towards a different direction or different style or maybe different path in the dance world. Because like I would have loved, that
Mhm.
don't have any turnout at all.
And I know, Devon, you're connecting with this a lot. I know you've been working with your turnout and everything, but no, these are things we talk about and dance. Yeah, like just to give you context.
No, it's more universal, and like,
Yeah.
you know, I think it's a great conversation because you're not, you know, people put a lot of years into learning and their craft and being able to teach it. So it's not an either or where we're trying to like not have them share their expertise, but can we create a space where it's more collaborative in that like we can really get, rather than just a concept, but like real life, how this impacts us and the questions we have. So I love this discussion because I think it's universal.
Absolutely. Everything should be more iterative.
Yeah. Iterative is the word.
Iterative.
Mhm.
Well, we probably should wrap up soon. I did want to ask quickly, just on the language front. I feel like a lot of people resist the word racist and want to say, well, I have inherent bias or implicit bias, but I'm not racist. But I also hear a lot of conversations very directly using the word, which makes a lot of sense to me because I feel like, I mean, I come at it by trying to relate by thinking, well, do I feel like someone is sexist if they're acting a certain way towards me? And I'm like, yes, I do. And, you know, it wouldn't help to remove that word just because they feel bad about it, right? Where are we with racism right now? Should we be using that word? If you have implicit bias, you are racist, right? Is that how we're understanding it? Or what's the best way to use the word and understand the word?
So I have no problem with the word racism. I think that the question is an interesting question, right? Because like, for instance, in my group, someone says, hey, do I go to a black person and call them black, African American? You know, like it's a general question. And my answer is always ask them.
Yeah.
So you may be in a room with someone who like, ask the people who are with you in the room, because there's no general way of going about and saying, this is how we're doing it. See, we're doing it is a generalization. And what we have to do is start getting on the human individual level and start seeing people as individuals rather than generalizations. So for me, if you ask me about racism or, you know, what I would rather black than African American, but you can go to someone else and they can say, you know, I like inherent bias, and then ask the question, well, can you tell me more about that? And now you're expanding your range of opportunities out here of what's here, and that's the experience of the Black community. There's no one way. We're so diverse in many in all we do that to kind of, for years people been trying to pin us into a box and saying you got to look like this, you got to act like this, you got to so I think
like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think your question is, it's always going to be an inquiry, not a generalization.
Interesting. And I can see how that ties in with whatever group you're with. Maybe you get on the same page about some of the terms and then you have a discussion. Correct. So that you can have the discussion. That's interesting.
Yeah. And at the same time, we're all interrogating like why we use the language we use.
Yeah.
And also making sure that we distinguish between being uncomfortable and unsafe. And that, you know, just like Devon was saying earlier, like some of these words make us feel uncomfortable, but we relate them with making us feel unsafe. And we have to really remember who's really unsafe in these situations.
So I'm going to do one diagram and I'm going to show my artistic ability, and then
Let's go.
It's very simple. As you can see, I went to art school. That's my circle, right?
Nice. It's a perfect circle for those who can't see.
Thank you.
Very perfect canvas.
That's right, on the perfect canvas. So this thing right here is called the comfort zone. And when we talk about stretching out our comfort zone, most people think that we're going to this place. We think we're going to send people to the danger zone. But what happens
is further out.
Which is further out. But what I realized is, if we can create a space and understand people, we're never going to take you to the danger zone. There's a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot between comfort zone and danger zone, which I call the learning zone. So you have to be uncomfortable. You got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, but you also have to create a space where people feel safe, that they're not going to be in a danger zone.
Yeah.
And that's where the learning occurs.
Yeah.
So
100%.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, you guys, what else? Is there anything else we need to touch on or haven't asked or haven't talked about from any of you before we wrap up?
I just want to
I'm
thank you
good.
guys. I want to acknowledge you and your community. I think that what you're bringing to the dance community and your own communities is powerful. And just keep the conversation going. You are the change, and it really, sometimes it feels very significant. Sometimes it feels like you may not be moving it the way you want. All I would just say is really keep doing what you're doing, and you all are inspiring in that way. So I want to thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. This is so
Yes.
inspiring, and we covered a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And
So
guys,
many
before we
gems and
go,
takeaways. Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Before we go, can everyone just smile and wave? And I'm going to take a screenshot. This is like if we were together, we'd take a selfie. Okay.
I do not.
All right, cool. Got it. Thanks, guys. It's our new way of taking photos together.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much.
That was so good.
That was.
So many gems. Always learning, man. Let me tell you.
Yeah.
Great job. Thank you all. It was nice meeting you all. Jessica and Clara, we go back, but Antuan, really pleasure meeting you, my man, and can't wait to see how the lab goes. And if you guys have any questions or I could be a support anyway down the road, just reach out.
I might actually reach out, Devon, with my organization I'm starting. I would love to have you come in and speak and help guide us and, you know, get us together. So I might reach out more via email with more information. I don't know if there's one on the podcast, but yeah, I might reach out more with
Absolutely. I'd love that. I'd love to contribute.
Great. And thank you so much for taking this time on your Labor Day, which I know is a holiday.
Slash probably still jam-packed work day for you.
All good. I try to do everything. I've worked since the morning, and then 12, I'm just going to hang out. So
nice.
Oh, good.
Nice.
All right, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks.